This is an AJ Plus special. I'm Sakhr Al-Makhadhi.
And Zab Mustafa.
It's 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, when Britain promised to help establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. A century later, some Palestinians are asking for an apology, but the British government says it's proud of the Balfour Declaration.
We are going to be speaking to British-Palestinian activist Farah Kotoni and Professor Adam Sutcliffe from Independent Jewish Voices. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Facebook post and we'll get back to you with some answers.
But before we talk to them, let's talk a little bit about what exactly the Balfour Declaration is.
So, in 1917, the UK's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter that became known as the Balfour Declaration, saying that the UK would use its best endeavours to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Balfour wrote the letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the UK's Jewish community.
Britain occupied Palestine from 1917 until 1948. And hours after Britain withdrew in 1948, Israel declared itself a state. And that accelerated the idea of Palestinian exile and dispossession, an idea that continues until this day. Between 1947 and 1949 alone, at least 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. So Britain clearly had a huge role to play. So let's talk about the idea of an apology. Is Britain to blame for Palestinian suffering? And would that single word, sorry, really change anything at all for Palestinians on the ground living under occupation?
We've been asking some British Palestinians.
The situation would change for Palestinians drastically. It would recognise them as an oppressed indigenous group of people with full rights as human beings. I don't think an apology is enough. We've seen a lot of colonial countries in the past apologise and nothing's come of it. So I think an apology has to be met with foreign policy change. This would include stopping arms trade with Israel. It would include an end to the demonisation of the BDS campaign, for example. So I think an apology has to come with real steps towards redress. I think an apology from the British government, if it came with real foreign policy change, it would make me feel a lot better about being a British Palestinian. The British government is responsible for the establishment of the settler colonial project in Palestine, and an apology would redress the situation. I don't think the UK government is going to apologise. We've seen the British Prime Minister Theresa May has said already that they're going to be marking the Balfour Declaration with pride this year. We know that the British Embassy in Tel Aviv is going to be hosting a huge celebration and they've invited the royal family. So I'm not hopeful that they're going to apologise.
But could people power force them to apologise? Earlier in 2017, 13,000 people signed a petition calling on the British government to say sorry. And the British government's response was to say that, no, we're not going to apologise, and in fact, we're proud of the Balfour Declaration. So we're going to play the Banksy video, and we're going to tell you that, in fact, in the absence of a sorry from the UK government, some Palestinians and other people did a mock apology in the West Bank, close to the wall. Some Palestinians held a mock apology ceremony with a mock queen.
Farah is half British, half Palestinian, and I'm going to start by asking you, do you feel like an apology from the British government would change anything?
I don't think an apology by itself would change anything, but I believe an apology along with a change in foreign policy, that would do a lot more on the ground. Currently, an apology would just acknowledge what Britain has done and not actually what currently is happening now. So the Balfour Declaration led to a whole span of suffering for Palestinians, and just acknowledging that in the beginning and not celebrating it is the first stepping stone. Then that can be led by foreign policy changes.
And do you think that an apology would make a difference to you, to your family?
Being British Palestinian, there is kind of conflicting sides, so I kind of believe that if the British side would kind of apologise for the suffering of Palestinians, it would kind of it would start for a lot of changes. It would be the start of many changes in the region if Britain could just acknowledge what the Balfour Declaration was wrong. That could lead to changes that need to be changed.
How do Palestinians on the ground feel about the idea of an apology? How much of a priority is this for them?
An apology is the first stepping stone for Palestinians on the ground. For example, we believe Palestinians in Britain, Palestinians on the ground in Palestine as well, that the first stepping stone is an apology. An apology should start a whole list of changes that Britain can do. Britain and Israel do have a close relationship. And if that relationship was actually not spent arming Israel, kind of not spent in putting Israel on a pedestal where it doesn't have to face its international law violations or any sort of crimes, and actually Britain were to start to even recognize Palestine in the first place, then that's when the changes could happen.
How closely linked are the two ideas of the apology and British recognition of the state of Palestine?
Sorry, could you say that again? I couldn't catch
Yeah,
that.
how closely linked do you think the two ideas are of the apology and British recognition of Palestine?
They're majorly interlinked. We have Emily Thornberry in the Labour Party here saying that if a Conservative government doesn't recognise Palestine, the next Labour government will. Recognising Palestine would be a much better way to address the centenary of Balfour Declaration than to celebrate it with Netanyahu.
If you have any questions, please feel free again to drop them into our Facebook post. We have one from Farman Ali Khan, who's asking, why did the British give the Zionists a separate land in their own country rather than promising to make them an Israeli state on the Palestinian land? I think he's basically saying, why Palestine? Why not give them land somewhere else? What would you have to say to that, Farah?
I mean, at the time, there was different options of what land they wanted to create a Jewish homeland in. I think the options like Uganda, Argentina, they were going to build this Jewish homeland in different states. But eventually they decided on Palestine because essentially the people who kind of created Balfour and signed Balfour and really pushed for Balfour in the beginning, they were powerful people in British democracy at the time. So essentially it was kind of handing over from British colonial power to a new colonial presence, which would be Israeli presence, and they would kind of maintain a colonial relationship with each other. So Britain knew if they created that Jewish homeland in Palestine, which then today is called Israel, they would maintain that close bond to the land and essentially use that land for all its national interests.
And one final question for you. Are you trying to undo or rewrite history?
In what sense?
In sense of, do you want to make a change right now, or do you think that the past can be undone?
I believe the past can't be undone, but we can learn from the mistakes of the past. And instead of Britain celebrating Balfour Declaration and celebrating the establishment of Israel, a rogue state, a state from its beginning, since the day of its birth, has oppressed Palestinians, the indigenous people of that land, I believe if we learn from that mistake, it shouldn't happen again. And also at the same time, Britain should see it as a mistake and not as a celebration, and actually start kind of solving its mistakes. So starting with ending the occupation of Palestine, ending the blockade on Gaza, and also putting back into question the right of return for 7.2 million Palestinian refugees.
Farah Koteni, thank you very much. It was really good to speak to you. So what effect would an apology have on Palestinians on the ground? Here's another Palestinian British voice.
The Balfour Declaration matters because it will change the narrative that the British people and many other people have been fed about Palestine and the creation of Israel as one of settler colonialism and the role that the British government played in that. My opinion of the current government, or the opinion of historical governments, would not change unless that they were active and put in place continuous support of the right for self-determination of the Palestinian people. I don't feel my identities are in conflict, as I don't believe that being British means that I have to agree with British foreign policy and Britain's role in crimes around the world, and that especially relates to Palestine and the Palestinian people. No, the UK government is not going to apologise for the Balfour Declaration. The consequences would be too seismic for them, for other colonial states, for other crimes that they've committed. And Theresa May is proud of the Balfour Declaration. They never focus on the crimes that were committed and the lives of the people before they turned up. They would need to really support the rights of the Palestinian people, from the right of return, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, to end the apartheid that is Israel, to allow for human rights to exist in that country. An apology.
So we've talked about the Balfour Declaration, about the idea of an apology, about Britain's responsibility. But there's another side of the Balfour Declaration that I want to talk about, and it's a side that some of Israel's supporters sometimes ignore. I want to play the quote card to you. This is a direct quote from the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and it says, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." So that was a direct quote from the Balfour Declaration 100 years ago. This week, British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson wrote in The Telegraph that there was unfinished business in the Balfour Declaration, and he mentioned that line about non-Jewish communities. And he said that the aim of the Balfour Declaration has not been fully realised.
Professor Sutcliffe is from Independent Jewish Voices, and the group produced a film called 100 Years After Balfour that questions the idea there was widespread Jewish support for the Balfour Declaration. So,
Professor Adam Sutcliffe, first of all, I want to ask you, 100 years ago, why were some British Jews really angry at the idea of British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine?
Well, 100 years ago, there were many different views in the Jewish community about Zionism and about the future of the Jewish people. And Zionism was a minority movement, really a relatively small minority movement. And even within the broad movement, thinking that Jews needed a homeland outside of Europe, there were many who thought that Palestine was not the place, precisely because there were already Palestinians living in Palestine, of course, and therefore there was the idea that a different territory needs to be found. This was the territorialist movement. But many other Jews were concerned that looking for a homeland elsewhere would undermine their attempt to assimilate, to fit in, to portray themselves as loyal citizens in the various countries in which they lived, in Western Europe in particular. And many others had very different concerns. There was a large socialist movement in the Jewish community, particularly in Eastern Europe, but that was very active also in London, and they were wanting to build alliances with non-Jews in the places where they lived to build a better world for all. Jews in Eastern Europe thinking of leaving to move elsewhere mostly were looking to the United States or other places in the New World to start a new life, rather than thinking in terms of Palestine.
So where did this idea come from that all Jews supported the idea of a Jewish state, all Jews were behind Israel, all Jews supported the Balfour Declaration? Where did that idea come from?
Well, the Zionist campaign was a very well-organized campaign, and it attempted to win support from European governments, and particularly from the British, by presenting the view that this was what the Jewish people wanted. And that was one of the ways, indeed, in which Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement, managed to get the ear of David Lloyd George and the British government during World War I. So that was part of their case, and it was, to say the very least, an exaggeration.
We have some people commenting on Facebook saying that if they criticise the Jewish state, they're accused of being anti-Semitic. How do you feel about that?
Well, of course, anti-Semitism exists, and when it's expressed, it must be condemned. But I think it is used, the accusation is used, as a way of trying to shut down legitimate criticism of Israel. And that is extremely concerning. And one of the reasons that we, in Independent Jewish Voices, think that we have an important role to play, and one of the reasons why we made our film, is to show the world that there are many Jews who feel very critical about the state of Israel and about the legacy of the Balfour Declaration. And we have many arguments based in our Jewish perspectives to criticize the current situation. And so we hope that our voices will gives sustenance and support to many non-Jews who are trying also to support the Palestinian cause and help to push back those unwarranted accusations of anti-Semitism.
So the film, 100 years after Balfour, that Independent Jewish Voices has produced, tell me exactly how, what some of those voices and what those voices are saying.
Well, there are a range of voices in the film. We have 7 Jews in the film of different ages, different backgrounds, and I encourage your viewers, by the way, to watch the film itself. It's 25 minutes long. It's easy to find on YouTube if you just simply search under Balfour or Independent Jewish. We include a rabbi, for example, who particularly argues that justice and doing justice is a central value in the Jewish tradition, and that means justice for all, not simply for benefiting the interests of Jews. Others in the film were raised in strongly Zionist environments, either in Israel or in the United Kingdom, and they feel that they've been, in essence, brainwashed and have come to see a wider political perspective, and they want to share really their experiences and reach out to others with them.
Should Britain apologise?
I think Britain has a lot to apologise for, not just in Palestine, but for many of the crimes it has committed as a colonial power. And I think it's absolutely legitimate to call for an apology, and I respect those in the Palestinian community who are calling for that very strongly. I think it needs to be said, though, that it's extremely unlikely that the British will apologise for the Balfour Declaration, for many reasons, not least of which is that if they started to apologise, there would almost be no end of the list of apologies to make. So I think it's for each of us to make the calls that are appropriate from our own position. So what we're trying to do as Jews is to challenge the voice coming very loudly from the Anglo-Jewish leadership, which is to celebrate the Balfour Declaration and to use it to cement the close relationship between Britain and Israel, and to say, well, no, that isn't just, and it isn't something that all Jews by any means support. And another thing we want to emphasize is what Britain can do to address the situation now. And what it did in 1948 is walk away from the situation. It left in May 1948 in a sort of hard Brexit, you might call it, just said we're going without any orderly transfer of power. And what there was a war leading to the establishment of the State of Israel and the beginning of a desperate situation for many Palestinians and a refugee crisis. So I'd like to salute Emily Thornberry, for example, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who has said that now is the moment, precisely at the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, for Britain finally to recognise a Palestinian state and see if that pushes things forward.
Just another question for you. Why do you think the Palestinian voice is ignored?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons for that. The voices in support of Israel are very extensive. They're very slick. They're well funded, and they have a lot of influence. And so, and they get their message across very effectively. I think also there's long been a belief, a rather double-edged belief, to say the least, that Jews have a great deal of influence in the world, and that was indeed one of the reasons, I think, why the British issued the Balfour Declaration in the first place. They thought it was important to curry Jewish favour in various places around the world, in the United States, and indeed also in Russia. And I think the voices of the subjugated, the voices of the non-West, are simply not taken as seriously in Britain and in other places at the moment, and that is something that really needs to change.
Dr. Sutcliffe, you talked about the idea of justice and that Britain shouldn't just be apologising, that it should be pushing for justice for the Palestinians. What does that mean? What exactly does that mean to you? How should that form take? How should justice be delivered for Palestinians?
Well, I think the principle of justice in its essence is very simple, that the rights of all people to live a dignified life are taken equally seriously, and so there isn't a privileging of one group over another. And it's absolutely clear that that is not the case in the region at the moment. how to take things forward from an extremely unjust situation in the direction of peace and justice is extremely complicated, and I don't think there's any one easy answer, and we in Independent Jewish Voices don't have one simple answer. And whether two states or ultimately some sort of binational state, perhaps a confederation, is the better solution to aim for, I don't know, but I think putting those issues back on the table is extremely important. I think it's also vital to address concrete issues today of Palestinian lives, the end of the occupation in the West Bank, the end of the stranglehold on Gaza, the addressal of the refugee crisis, and taking steps immediately to improve people's lives.
We've got some really interesting points coming in on Facebook. Again, feel free to add your questions, add your comments on that.
So another question for you, Dr. Sutcliffe. Do you think the Balfour Declaration is being misrepresented by Israel? Because we talked a little bit about how it mentioned, you know, the rights of non-Jewish communities living in Palestine, and that really seems to have been ignored. So do you think, is Israel deliberately misrepresenting the Balfour Declaration?
I wouldn't precisely say that. The Balfour Declaration, although it's very short, it's only 67 words long, it's full of complexity and ambiguity. It promises a Jewish home for the Jewish people. What exactly that means is unclear. It came to be interpreted to mean a state, but it wasn't clearly promised in the form of the state in the declaration. That clause is there, absolutely, in the Balfour Declaration, and I think, yes, there are some who'd like to gloss over that. I don't often agree with Boris Johnson, but I think highlighting that clause and saying that needs to be more properly addressed, because the rights of non-Jews in Palestine are certainly being prejudiced at the moment. That is one way of, in fact, moving in a positive way from the Balfour Declaration itself. Even though in other ways the Balfour Declaration has been the start of so many of those problems, but we can still work from it to argue for a way forward.
We talked a bit about the idea of being silenced, and how some Jews with dissenting voices are silenced as self-hating Jews or are accused of perpetuating anti-Semitism. How do you, in Independent Jewish Voices and other people with dissenting voices, with voices that disagree with the occupation, that disagree with the repression of the Palestinian people, how do you make your voices heard?
Well, in various ways, and we're trying to do it in more and more innovative ways, such as the film that we've made to use social media and other forms to disseminate our message widely. We want to reach out to the people in the Middle East, to the Palestinians and Muslims around the world, but we also have a lot of work to do within the Jewish community, indeed, because I think a lot of Jews still, particularly within the organized religious parts of the Jewish community, receive quite a lot of pro-Zionist propaganda, and younger Jews increasingly are questioning those arguments, which just don't make sense to them very often, and they need to know that there is a movement within the Jewish community that shares those objections and critiques, so that we can build strength within the Jewish community. So we have to keep on trying, and I think steadily we are winning through, and our numbers are growing and our voice is being heard more.
Dr. Adam Sutcliffe, thank you very much. That's Dr. Adam Sutcliffe from Independent Jewish Voices. So we want to bring you one final British-Palestinian voice. We talked to Ziad, who thinks that the UK has got a lot to apologise for, and not just to Palestinians.
Government were to apologise for the Balfour Declaration, I think it would make me feel very much part of this country. It would make me feel like I belonged here in some way. I mean, I love this country and I grew up here. I love this city. It's my city. And I think this country's given a lot to the world and to me, but it's also taken a lot away. Not just from Palestinians, but from a lot of other people around the world. Britain's got a great history, but it's also got a dirty one, and I think that needs to be recognised and accounted for and apologised for. I think the problem is wider. I think Britain has a a long colonial history in which the Palestinians are just one of the victims. So I think Britain has a long way to go to recognise what it's done, to recognise the suffering that other people have endured at its hands, not just Palestinians, and to make sense of that as a country as well, to teach it in our schools, to condemn the crimes that they committed, and to stop romanticising or romanticising a colonial history which actually took so much from so many people.
And that brings us almost to the end of our AJ Plus special. It's 100 years today since the Balfour Declaration, when Britain promised to help establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. We've talked about the declaration itself, whether Britain should apologise for that declaration, and it said that it's not going to because it's proud of the declaration. We've talked about Palestinian exile and the suffering that they've faced for so long under the Israeli occupation. So my great thanks to Farah Kotani, who's a British-Palestinian activist, and Dr. Adam Sutcliffe, who is a historian with Independent Jewish Voices.
Thanks so much for watching.
And keep those comments coming in, and we'll try to answer them as soon as we can. Thank you.